We've gotten some really interesting stuff from you guys lately about building those strong connections, especially that book, A Lasting Promise.
A Lasting Promise, A Christian Guide to Fighting for Your Marriage.
Yeah, exactly. By Scott Stanley, Daniel Trayton, Savannah McCain, and Milt Bryan. And what really stood out to us, going through it, is how these ideas, these like fundamental principles for a really strong marriage, they actually have so much to offer for all the important relationships in our lives,
Yeah,
not
absolutely.
just romantic ones.
Yeah.
So we thought for this deep dive, let's really pull out those core concepts and see how they can help us all understand connection in a much, much deeper way.
I love that idea. And this is actually a revised edition of the book. It brings together, those timeless biblical wisdom and like the best of university-based
Oh,
research,
that's interesting.
including insights from the PRIP program, the
Yeah.
Prevention and Relationship Enhancement
Yeah,
program.
yeah, I've heard of that.
It's this research-backed approach to like really strengthening relationships, particularly for couples. So while the book is designed as a practical guide, for married couples at any stage, I think the deeper human desires and the relational dynamics it explores, they're truly universal. They apply to everyone.
Totally agree. At its heart, the book really digs into this deep longing we all have, right? This yearning for a really profound connection, for absolute trust, for that feeling of being completely open and totally accepted without any conditions.
Hmm.
And they use this really powerful image, Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden before the fall. Remember, that state of being naked and unashamed.
Yeah, that's such a striking image.
It is. It speaks to that ultimate vulnerability and perfect acceptance that I think deep down we all crave.
And you know what's so fascinating? That image, naked and unashamed, it really captures this fundamental human desire in our closest relationships, right? Like
Right.
it speaks to this state of relational oneness that we're all instinctively seeking. And that's exactly what we're going to do in this deep dive today. We want to understand those barriers that can get in the way, the things that keep us from reaching this desired state of oneness in all our important relationships and all the relationships that really matter to us.
Right. And we're going to use those core principles from A Lasting Promise as our guide.
Absolutely.
So let's break this down a bit further. Over the next little while, we're going to explore several key ideas that the book lays out.
Okay.
First, we're going to look at this concept of oneness in marriage, as they describe it. Explore the different dimensions of it, spiritual, emotional, intellectual, even physical.
Right.
But, and this is crucial, really understanding that oneness isn't about losing yourself in the other person.
Yeah, that's important to clarify.
It's not about becoming one and the same.
Yeah.
Oneness isn't fusion.
Right.
It's more like this beautiful harmony where two individual melodies create a richer shared song together.
I like that.
Recognizing the value of each individual note is key. Then we'll get into the book's emphasis on permanence in marriage, how it's not just seen as a commitment, but as the very foundation upon which deeper intimacy, that fundamental acceptance that we talked about, can really grow and deepen over time.
And we can't forget the theological significance they discuss, right? How marriage is presented as this reflection of God's own nature and his relationship with humanity.
Right.
It adds this whole other layer to understanding the meaning of these committed relationships.
It does. And building on that, the book really dives into this profound longing for a naked and unashamed relationship,
Right.
which they break down further into some key elements like profound closeness, a sense of fearlessness in just being yourself, that complete acceptance, vulnerability without reservation, genuine accessibility to each other, and even the sense of relational innocence.
It's like painting this powerful picture of what we ideally seek in our closest connections, what we're all drawn to.
Exactly. But as we all know, getting there isn't always easy. So we're going to turn our attention to the barriers to this oneness,
Right.
the things that get in the way.
Yeah.
And the book uses that story of the fall of Adam and Eve in Genesis to really illustrate those barriers, focusing especially on that emergence of fear of rejection and how our differences, those things that might initially attract us to someone, can actually become sources of tension and conflict.
Yeah, I see that play out all the time.
Me too. And finally, we'll examine what the book identifies as the immediate consequence of sin,
Okay.
that act of covering up and hiding, which they present as a direct response to that newfound fear and has a huge impact on how we relate to each other, not just in romantic relationships, but in all those close connections.
I'm really interested to dig into that.
Yeah, me too. So with this idea of a deep longing for connection in mind, let's dive into this foundational concept of oneness.
Okay.
The book references Matthew 19, where Jesus talks about, a man leaving his father and mother and being united to his wife, and they become one flesh.
Right.
And he concludes by saying, so they are no longer two, but one flesh. It really emphasizes this idea of a deep merging, wouldn't you say?
It does, and it's interesting because that concept of oneness, it appears in various forms throughout Christian theology. But the book specifically highlights how Jesus uses it in the context of marriage to really underscore the principle of permanence.
Oh, that's interesting.
Like, he's basically suggesting that divorce goes against God's original intention, which is for two individuals to become and remain unified throughout their lives. And the book even goes as far as to describe this oneness as a covenant of spiritual unity, where hearts and souls are deeply intertwined.
Wow.
Yeah.
And they make a really important distinction here, addressing a common concern, that this oneness isn't about one person's identity being swallowed up by the other.
Yeah, that's a really common misconception.
Yeah, they actually address that fear directly, asking, the two shall become one, but which one? And they argue that Scripture doesn't portray it that way at all.
Exactly. They make this great analogy to the body of Christ, described in 1 Corinthians 12. Where it's presented as a single body made up of many diverse, unique members, each with its own distinct role.
Right.
Similarly, in marriage, and I'd argue in any truly strong relationship, you have two distinct individuals coming together to form a new us. But it doesn't mean that the individual you or me ceases to exist. It's a type of unity that embraces and values those individual differences rather than trying to erase them.
That makes total sense. It's about creating something new and shared while still respecting and honoring the unique contributions of each person.
Exactly.
The book even refers to this as a profound mystery, something that we might not be able to fully explain, but it's something we experience, And this suggests that there's a lot of freedom in how any two people in a close relationship can express their unique form of oneness.
Yeah, I love that. And another interesting point they make is that, while happy couples manifest this oneness in countless different ways, couples who are struggling often fall into these surprisingly similar patterns.
Oh, really?
Yeah, like emotional distance or constant conflict. It kind of highlights that the ways we erode that sense of connection, they can be quite predictable.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
So moving on to this emphasis on permanence, the book highlights Jesus' statement, therefore what God has joined together, let man not separate.
Right.
They really drive home this idea that marriage is meant to be a lifelong commitment.
Absolutely. And while they acknowledge that God's love extends to everyone, including those who've gone through divorce, the book's main focus is on preventing divorce and empowering couples to truly achieve the full potential of their marriage bond, a bond that's meant to last. The argument is that this foundational sense of permanence rooted in a deep commitment is what creates the safety and stability necessary for a marriage, which, let's be honest, is made up of two imperfect individuals to truly thrive.
Yeah, that makes sense. And this leads into something that I think is really relevant for a lot of people today.
Yeah.
The book talks about how our modern culture often fosters these really high, sometimes unrealistic expectations for our relationships,
Oh, yeah.
where we might expect, constant romantic intensity and this unwavering acceptance without any effort.
Yeah, like it should just happen effortlessly.
Right, exactly. And the book offers this more grounded perspective. While it doesn't discourage having high hopes for our relationships, it gently reminds us that all human connections are inevitably going to face imperfections and challenges. The true strength of a relationship lies in our ability to navigate those rough waters together within this secure framework of a steadfast commitment, that deep commitment.
Yeah.
And the profound benefit of believing in that permanence is that it creates this safe space for a deeper intimacy to grow and a much deeper level of acceptance of each other's, flaws and quirks, those little things.
It's about embracing the whole package.
Yeah, exactly. So this understanding of commitment then leads into their discussion about God's nature and how marriage, from their perspective, reflects that nature.
Yeah.
They make a very strong argument for the key role that marriage plays throughout the entire narrative of the Bible.
Right.
From the creation account in Genesis all the way to the imagery of the wedding supper of the Lamb in Revelation.
It's a recurring theme.
It is. What's really fascinating is this specific connection they draw to Genesis 1:26-27, where it says that God created humankind in his own image, both male and female. They argue that marriage isn't simply a social construct, but a fundamental way in which God reveals these essential truths about himself, about his character, and his relationship with humanity.
It elevates marriage to a whole new level.
It does.
Yeah.
And so, through committed marriage, two individuals made in God's image are actually participating in something much larger than themselves.
Right.
They're reflecting aspects of God's nature to the world around them.
It's a beautiful concept.
It is. And this brings us back to that powerful image we discussed at the beginning, being naked and unashamed.
Right.
The book really delves into this deep longing that the phrase evokes, that fundamental human desire for profound closeness, that sense of fearlessness in being truly seen, for unconditional acceptance, the ability to be completely vulnerable, genuine accessibility to each other, and even a sense of relational innocence. Think about that feeling of total ease and acceptance you might have experienced with a close friend or a family member, you know?
It's that feeling of truly belonging. And, I think this is where the book's message becomes really universal and relatable.
Yeah.
Even if someone doesn't share the religious framework, that intrinsic desire for a relationship where you can be completely yourself without any fear of judgment or rejection is just a fundamental part of being human.
It is.
And the book makes this great point that when we're looking for a partner or any kind of close connection, we're not inherently looking for someone to constantly disagree with. We're longing for that best friend, that soulmate, with whom we can share this kind of unashamed acceptance.
It's so true. We're often initially drawn to people because we see the possibility of experiencing that kind of profound connection.
Yeah.
But then, as the book describes, using the story of Adam and Eve after the fall in Genesis 3, something shifts.
Oh, yeah.
Barriers start to pop up that erode that initial sense of connection. We start, maybe unconsciously, building walls instead of bridges.
It's like that initial spark starts to fade.
It does. And that takes us to this critical discussion of the barriers that prevent this oneness.
Okay.
The book uses the story of Adam and Eve's temptation and sin to illustrate these barriers. They were given one clear boundary, right? Not to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil.
Right.
But that boundary became the very focus of their temptation.
The forbidden fruit.
It is. And their immediate consequence of their disobedience is so revealing. They cover themselves up. And the book asks this really thought-provoking question. They saw the tree, they touched the fruit, they ate it. So why did they immediately cover their bodies? Specifically those parts associated with intimacy and their physical differences.
That's interesting.
It is. And what's insightful is the book's interpretation. They suggest that by covering themselves, Adam and Eve were reacting to this newfound sense of a lack of complete acceptance.
They no longer felt that safe, secure feeling.
Right. They no longer felt that original freedom and their vulnerability. And what's significant is that they covered the very areas where their differences were most apparent.
The things that set them apart.
Yeah. And this resonates so deeply in all our relationships, don't you think? We often become more guarded, more closed off when we're with someone who sees things differently or views the world in a different way than we do.
It's like we put up our defenses.
We do.
Yeah.
And the book highlights how those very differences that might have initially drawn us to someone can, over time, become the basis for friction and frustration if they're not navigated with understanding and care.
Right.
They even point out that research in relationship dynamics often backs up this observation.
That's fascinating.
It is. So the biblical narrative continues with God confronting Adam and Eve. And their response to being found hiding is incredibly telling. Adam says, I heard you in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked, so I hid. And the book suggests that it's unlikely God didn't know where they were,
Right.
Instead, it seems like God wanted them to really confront their actions and this new way of being, this change in their state of being.
To face the consequences.
Yeah. And Adam's answer clearly identifies the root emotion driving their need to hide.
Fear.
Fear. It wasn't simply their physical nakedness, but this newfound fear of rejection after their disobedience that made them want to cover up from each other and hide from God. This was an emotional experience that was completely new to them.
It was a completely new reality.
It was.
Yeah.
And with the introduction of sin and shame came this sense of separation and this deep fear of not being fully accepted.
Right.
And the book really emphasizes how this fear becomes the root of so many barriers in all kinds of relationships. Instead of that unrestrained giving of oneself in love that characterized the naked and unashamed state, individuals in close relationships, and again, not just romantic ones, start to protect themselves out of this fear of being hurt, misunderstood, or rejected.
It's a self-preservation instinct.
It is. And this fear of true closeness often stemming from past hurts or the perceived potential for future pain, becomes a huge obstacle to achieving that deep oneness that we all long for.
It's like we're holding ourselves back from experiencing the fullness of connection.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So to recap what we've covered, we explore this idea of oneness in marriage as this multifaceted concept. It doesn't erase our individuality, but rather creates this powerful sense of us. We looked at how that commitment to permanence provides the essential safety and security for true intimacy and deep acceptance to develop and grow. And we also touched on the theological significance of marriage, as presented in the book, highlighting its role as a reflection of God's nature.
It's a powerful concept.
It is, and we spent quite a bit of time understanding that universal human longing for a naked and unashamed connection, that connection that's characterized by complete openness and unconditional acceptance.
Right.
And crucially, we examine the barriers
Mm-hmm.
that can prevent us from achieving this ideal, focusing on how that fear of rejection, often arising from our perceived differences, can create tension and lead to that instinctive reaction to cover up, to hide,
Yeah.
just like Adam and Eve did after the fall.
Yeah.
So while our discussion has been grounded in those principles outlined in A Lasting Promise, and it uses the context of marriage, we really want you to think about how these fundamental aspects of human connection resonate in all the important relationships in your life. Whether it's with your family, your closest friends, or even colleagues, that underlying desire for trust, for openness, and for genuine acceptance, it's a universal human experience.
It's what connects us all.
It is. And that fear of rejection, well, it can be a really powerful obstacle in any of those connections.
Absolutely. Understanding these dynamics, the way they're explained in A Lasting Promise, can offer incredibly valuable insights into how we can build stronger and more meaningful bonds in all areas of our lives.
It does. It really prompts us to consider the dynamics at play, even the unspoken ones, in all our significant relationships. So here's a final thought for you to consider as you go about your day. Think about your own close relationships. Where might there be some metaphorical fig leaves? In what ways might you or the other person be holding back, covering up? And how might a deeper understanding of that fundamental fear of rejection empower you to build more naked and unashamed connections? Connections characterized by greater openness, deeper trust, and that more profound acceptance. Think about how consciously embracing those differences rather than fearing them could actually lead to a richer, more fulfilling sense of oneness in your life. Like all its different facets.
That's definitely worth pondering.
It is. We've gotten some really interesting stuff from you guys lately about building those strong connections, especially that book, A Lasting Promise.
A Lasting Promise, a Christian guide to fighting for your marriage.
Yeah, exactly. By Scott Stanley, Daniel Trathan, Savannah McCain, and Milt Bryan. And what really stood out to us, going through it, is how these ideas, these like fundamental principles for a really strong marriage, they actually have so much to offer for all the important relationships in our lives.
Yeah, absolutely.
Not just romantic ones.
Yeah.
So we thought for this deep dive, let's really pull out those core concepts and see how they can help us all understand connection in a much, much deeper way.
I love that idea. And this is actually a revised edition of the book. It brings together, those timeless biblical wisdom and like the best of university-based research.
Oh, that's interesting.
Including insights from the PRIP program, the Prevention and Relationship Enhancement Program.
Yeah, I've heard of that.
It's this research-backed approach to like really strengthening relationships, particularly for couples. So while the book is designed as a practical guide, for married couples at any stage, I think the deeper human desires and the relational dynamics it explores, they're truly universal. They apply to everyone.
Totally agree. At its heart, the book really digs into this deep longing we all have, right? This yearning for a really profound connection, for absolute trust, for that feeling of being completely open and totally accepted.